I'm Chris Stone, Professor of Practice of Public Integrity here at the Blavatnik School, and Chair of the Chandler Sessions on Integrity and Corruption. And we're joined by all the members of the Chandler Sessions, as well as our panel, which I will introduce in a moment. Our subject today is corruption in political party finance in the UK and more broadly, focusing on the efforts to make reforms and why those reforms are so difficult. A review of the situation in the UK of party finance in the United Kingdom over the last several centuries concluded in 2020 that the system of regulating political party finance here in the UK was, in global context, remarkably unregulated, but predicted that that was about to change because of comprehensive recommendations that were being made by the Committee on Standards in Public Life. Those recommendations were published in July of 2021 with great hope that they would quickly make their way into legislation. But those hopes were dashed. The Electoral Act that finally passed in 2022 included less than a half dozen of the 30 or so recommendations made by the committee. What were widely regarded by campaigners as the most important reforms were left unattended. So let me start, Daniel, with you. Why is this so hard?
Well, in a nutshell, the people who have the power to change it don't want to change it. Simply, and that in the UK context leads to a huge elephant in the political room around political party financing. I think that there is a particularly UK-centric problem with the debate as well, because of the dynamics, the funding landscape of our two largest parties. In the House of Commons. In the case of the Conservatives, the current party of government, you have a party financing model that is largely based on a relatively small number of donors providing very large amounts, whereas conversely, Labour's support, both directly and through the trade unions, represents a large amount of very small donations. So finding any sort of middle ground between those two extremes in terms of how you transform the model, I think is going to be incredibly difficult. And the baseline from which we're working is really, really challenging, as you set out, Chris. I mean, there is, this is a kind of limitless Wild West of how much you can pump into the political party system in the UK because there are no upper limits. And so we were starting from a particularly difficult place anyway. And then the final point I've made just by way of opening is I don't think we can look at the financing of our political parties as an isolated issue when it comes to the integrity of our political system. There are obviously links with lobbying and the efforts that some political funders go to influence government policy, either directly or inadvertently. There are, it would seem, links, worrying links that look like patronage in the upper house, that are skirting close to what is legal, frankly. And there's a sustained pattern there as well. So the sort of issues of influence, access, patronage are all part of the same sort of knot that we need to untangle around UK party financing.
Why? I mean, you come at this both overseeing or from a governance role in this advocacy organization, and your own experience advising companies about how to avoid the pitfalls and the problems and keep out of trouble, and also your career in law enforcement. Why is it so hard even to put the basic regulations in place?
I think I'm going to be rather controversial and say, actually, it's not that hard at all. It's fairly straightforward from the perspective of we know what needs to be done. And I think that our focus needs to be on what are the current circumstances. So when we look at the landscape, the geopolitical landscape, and what has occurred over the last couple of years, that in and of itself should have focused the lens of all the political parties about what do we need to do about this. And so the answers are there, but I think, like Daniel's already said, in terms of political will to deliver on that, it doesn't necessarily seem to be there. And I think also when we look at the legislation is outdated. So we have the Political Parties and Elections and Referendum Act, which was from 2000. And there have been efforts to reform this, but I'm afraid that those efforts haven't been successful. And I think what we need to do is to really think about something that you four actually said, which I really appreciate, which was around this 4 principles of transparency, accountability, practicality, and the possibility of sanctions. So if we look at the reform process as really trying to bring transparency into the process, then think about actually who do we want to hold accountable? Those who are donating money, but also those who are receiving finances from a range of different donors. Then also about how do we make this practicable? How do we make it so that those who are smaller parties, there isn't a massive burden on them in relation to complying with any potential new changes to reform? And then finally, around that sanctions regime, what does it look like if an individual or a party breaks the rules? Are the sanctions in place currently robust enough to prevent or to at least deter the rule breaking? So I don't necessarily think it's that difficult at all. I think that there just isn't. And when you look at actually some of the discussions when the National Security Bill was going through Parliament, it was made law just a couple of weeks ago. You could see that actually there was quite cross-party support in the House of Lords for some of the amendment that unfortunately was removed by the government, but there was cross-party support. So I think it's about how do we make sure that the public consciousness of these issues comes to a point, hopefully, where we can help the current administration and any future administration and encourage them to move forward and deliver on those reforms.
But let's look at what's happened in the past week. It's we often see, as I'm sure plenty of people in the room are familiar with, significant announcements sort of slip out just before the parliamentary summer recess. Yeah. And there've been a couple of things. So there is the limit that the government is sending proposals to the Electoral Commission to raise the limit on the anonymity of political donors in the UK, I think to about £11,000. It's basically kind of backdating it with about a decade's worth of inflation that nobody's got round to in prior years. So that would sort of significantly uprate the threshold for which you have to declare the source of the donation. And it will also represent a very significant increase in the regulations on campaign spending for national general elections, whereas the Committee on Standards in Public Life has previously recommended that's pulled down by 15%. So nobody sort of checked what that would actually do with the inflation on that side. And I think what in real terms, because that's a whole load of inflationary increases all at once, that significantly changes the landscape around the transparency of political donations. That's a political choice that's been made to do that. With the campaign spending, the benefit of having that cap is you reduce the demand on the system. You don't end up with a situation like we see with US elections, where you have these vast amounts of money being pumped into the presidential election campaign, and the campaign limit is intended to reduce that demand. So you push that up, and then obviously you start then allowing inviting parties to raise ever more cash. So I think that it's not there are those tweaks and developments to legislation which could, signal good intent, but then you see steps like those that I've just set out, which really are going in the wrong direction relative to what all of the regulators and those who contact from the margins of civil society have to say on the topic.
I actually just wanted to pick up on a point that you made earlier, Daniel, around whether the public would countenance the proposal by politicians in relation to maybe the taxpayer fund in elections. And I think in light of, the scandals that we see and the disquiet around many different issues, whether it's, the House of Lords and what's happening there, or whether it's VIP lanes and all of these issues, I think actually, in my view, maybe I'm just speaking on my own terms here, but I think the public would be much more satisfied if you, because at the moment the figures are this: the public pay about 12 million a year in terms of contributions towards our election funding. So I think the statistics show that we would need to spend an additional 23 million in order to cover the election spending for the parties. I think that's a really small price to pay in order to potentially remove the need for external donors to fund our elections. And I think when you look at some of the consequences of having this external money brought into our political system, you look at, for example, financing coming from those who've been actually convicted of criminal offences, including fraud and bribery. You look at parties who've received this money, known that the individuals have been convicted and then refused to return the money, knowing that. As a member of the public and a taxpaying member of the public, I would actually prefer for us to spend the money and know that we have a degree of certainty and there is no longer that excuse to seek external funding. Because we spend, I think I was reading an article that said we spend 120 million pounds a year on communication consultants in this country. So 23 million in the grand scheme of things seems like a drop in the ocean.
I don't know the polling numbers or the survey numbers in the UK, but one poll I saw in the US showed that while 80% of the public were absolutely certain there was massive corruption in the financing of politics, there was less than 20% support in the same poll for public financing of those elections. So an acknowledgement that the current system is riddled with corruption and an invitation to corruption, and yet a complete refusal, at least at reasonable numbers, to move towards the one alternative you both mentioned now. So I wonder if there simply is no other alternative and it's just a question of changing those numbers or figuring out a scheme for doing it, or if there's something else that one can do to deal with that gap.
Well, I mean, our policy position on this is very clear in terms of how you tackle the system as it's currently structured. We think that there should be a cap on individual and corporate donations of £10,000. That is particularly uncomfortable for the current party of government because the size of the individual donations that they receive, but we think they've got to set a level of ambition around this. We think that the transparency reporting thresholds, those that I just mentioned, being lifted because of the inflationary impact, should actually be consistent with the permissibility threshold of the donation, which is currently £500. So that would be a significant change. And there's also, and I've mentioned, we support the Committee on Standards Public Life recommendation to drop the campaign limit, the campaigning allowance. There's a big hole in that, though, as it's currently structured, because it doesn't include staff. So it includes everything else. But actually, if you were to really look at the number of human beings who are involved in a general election campaign for any of the political parties in the UK, you would find that was a significant part of the cost base, which is not being regulated. So that needs fixing too. Chris, you mentioned the unincorporated association problem. That, as Lloydette says, it is not difficult to fix these things. Actually doing it, you don't need some intergalactically complicated piece of legislation to do it. You've just got to have the political will to do it. And in the absence of political leadership on this and political appetite, it will always be a scandal that drives change, and that's what history has changed us.
Absolutely.
How does this story look when you pull back, look at your experience in Latin America? What do you see as how is this system operating that might make it so hard to get a handle on?
Well, let me first begin with the caveat. I am no expert at all on the subject of election financing. I have carried out investigations into corporate corruption, and that led me accidentally to come and to be able to get a very close view of the whole process in which that financing worked. Specifically in the Lava Jato case. I would also like to tell you that there are some people who are very much in favor of unregulated contribution. And one of them is Dom Emilio Odebrecht, the patriarch of the now shattered empire of Odebrecht, who has recently published a book, it's very recent, in which he tries to come back to all the attacks. So it's eloquently titled A War Against Brazil. And what he says, he saw the donation as one of the ways in which his enterprises were contributing to democracy. That meant giving resources to all those who wanted to enter into politics and didn't have the money to pay for a campaign. So here was...
It was public finance.
Yeah, in a way, very generous and all of that. What we saw in the investigation of Lava Jato made me think that Don Emilio was somehow disingenuous. So in that case, Odebrecht, as well as other companies, not just offered money, it offered campaign, strategic services, which were of great utility, of great use. And my final remarks on that would be, has it changed? The ecology has changed. The predatory habits, no. I mean, at the time of Lava Jato, we lived in an ecology of sharks. Now we live on piranhas, in an ecology of piranhas, but they keep growing. They keep growing, and in a way, they don't have the technical refinement, the financial engineering that at some time was prodigious that Odebrecht and the other Brazilian companies had.
All right. Well, I'm not sure that gives us any more guidance of how to deal with it, but it's a very vivid picture
That's on Emilio.
of how this plays out. And in some ways, it's humbling, right? It just suggests that what should our goal be here? What is the goal of reform? Is it are we trying to do we have some hope of eliminating the role that money plays in politics? Seems unlikely. Yeah, I suspect that money and politics have gone together since there was money or politics. So how do we think about the goal of reform here? Are we trying to purify politics, or are we trying to stop particular harms of the corruption?
So purification, I think, is a lofty goal, but probably one that we're not going to ever achieve. When you were speaking, I was thinking about this saying that says that sunlight is the best disinfectant. And I think part of the reform needs to be around understanding who is doing what, who is putting money into our political parties. And so this gives me an opportunity to set out, some of the work that we've been doing at Spotlight on corruption around knowing your donor. So I love that phrase, because as a financial crime investigator, prosecutor, knowing your client, I love that, knowing your donor policy. And it's really around, we're calling for all the political parties to implement a policy of knowing their donors in advance of the next election, which we don't know the date of yet, but will be in the next year or so. I think as part of that, what we are also advocating for is this issue around, individual parties setting out their donations policy statements. So which will say things like these are the limits on the types of donations that we will accept. This is the policy on the types of money that we won't accept from particular types of individuals, and really making that clear to the general public and to other parties as well. Because the reality of this is that it poses, if you set out the type of donations that you're going to refuse, what basis are you going to do that on? So we've set out sort of three areas. One is, does it pose a reputational risk to your party, your political party? Does it pose a risk to the UK's political system? Because we know that this discussion around electoral finance is really also directly connected to democracy and the integrity of our democracy. And then the final thing is, you should refuse your donation if it poses a national security risk to the UK. And again, as I said earlier on, that's particularly important in light of our current geopolitical circumstances. So I think what we have done at Spotlight is really try to practicalize this policy. We've provided a draft policy for the parties to adopt. We've provided a risk assessment that they can adopt also in terms of understanding where your money is coming from, understanding the true source of your money. But I think ultimately we know that whilst we are going to encourage, we're going to continue to advocate for that. we need regulation to really force through, because no party is going to do this willingly. We've seen that. Unless there is the regulation to back this up, we're not going to get the change that we actually really need.
I've always admired rock stars who do a big concert and then their friends show up in the audience, and all of a sudden you think you're going to a rock concert with one band and you've got all their friends on stage too. So Marlene is Minister of Legal and Constitutional Affairs for the Republic of Jamaica, and somehow has taken time out from her schedule there to join us on this webinar. So come on up to the stage and play a few songs. Tell us what are you doing about this in Jamaica?
Thank you, Chris. We're not quite yet to the Republic of Jamaica, but we're working to achieve that. First of all, let me just thank you for this very important webinar. Couldn't be more timely. It is not only relevant to what is happening in the UK, but also globally. So just wanted to say that Jamaica actually is the first country in the Caribbean to have adopted campaign finance legislation. It's a comprehensive campaign finance regime. We took significant steps in striking the balance between the need for campaign financing and the need for adequate safeguards against abuse. Some parts of the law are in effect and others are to come in. So these are our 2016 amendment to the Representation of the People's Act. And it increases the mechanism for funding political campaigns, not only increases opportunities for access to campaign financing, but also introduced an extensive set of obligations for political candidates, political parties, contributors, and donors. For me, as a political practitioner, I'll just say that it's so important to know who is wielding influence on your government, in whose interests are decisions being taken, and who is influencing decision. That's usually a hidden hand. And I think anything that can be done to bring this in the spotlight will go a far way in helping the people who the government is supposed to make a decision on their behalf.
Why is it that there's this sense that there is no political will among politicians? You seem to have enthusiasm for this. Do you pay a price for your support for this, or what is it that allows you to take up this issue when other elected officials seem shy?
Chris, you always know how to ask the tough questions. Admittedly, it is not an easy issue. And when you are in elected office as part of a team and you take a stance on issues that bedevil a system, of course you pay a price. I mean, that's the best hidden secret. But I think it's clarifying what it is that you stand for. And I think more we can understand who is influencing the people who have the power to make decisions, the better we will know what really is happening in government. So for me, it's really no magic. It's about using the power that you have to do what is required to advance the best interest of the people.
Terrific. Thank you so much. Thanks for joining in the conversation. I'll come back to the panels and also to the room in a moment, but let me ask, we also have Janet Love on the who's joined in. Let me just tell everyone, Janet is in charge of the National Electoral Commission in South Africa, and the South Africans are heading into a highly contested national election this next year. What should the goal of reform in this area be? What's a realistic goal that the regulation of political party finance can achieve when the concern is about corrupt influence over political parties? Do you have an answer in South Africa?
So just a quick disclaimer, my first term as an electoral commissioner came to an end, and that whether or not I serve a second term is not clear. So right now I am footloose and fancy free and speaking on my own behalf. So just that disclaimer. But look, I would say that the situation in South Africa is really one in which we're really grappling with all of the same issues, and we maybe have attempted to put in place some solutions, and I'll come back to that in a second, to deal with possibilities of alternatives. But I think that the key issues at play are first and foremost being able to give people a sense of who they're voting for. And money obviously talks. It has ever since any official that was in power over others, so since the beginning of any kind of polity. But it certainly talks now. And so it's to have the transparency about, who's doing the talking, who's doing the manipulation behind the scenes and so on. So that transparency is the critical issue. But of course, it sounds, I think that the panel heard some views that, the answer is not that difficult. And I think I wish that were the case, but I think that the answer is a little bit more difficult. And I say this not because, I think there's some fabulous suggestions that have come up here, but we all know that having a regulation in place is really the beginning of a very long story. And I say this because, you think about something like Cambridge Analytica, no regulation was in place that would easily have enabled us to understand that the actual driving force behind many of the political campaigns was very far away and funded in very, very different kinds of ways. So I think that when you're dealing with money at the moment, you really have to be thinking about what's your investigative capacity, what's your enforcement, your prosecutorial, your judicial capacity to deal with money matters. And I think that then in a way trumps the nature of the regulatory framework to a very large extent. So I think that's the first thing. When you talk about transparency into the process, getting that transparency is actually not that easy, and that's what we've been trying to do. Underneath the transparency issue is also, I think, a huge concern, which is a concern about the lack of trust in political parties and elected office bearers and so on. And I know that issue of a lack of trust is associated, of course, with issues to do with corruption and malfeasance and the abuse of office for personal gain. And that is, that's true in many countries. The problem, I think, is that that's not the full reason for a lack of trust in political parties. So much also turns on two other issues which are related, one of which is particularly related. The first is, of course, the issue about how do you hold elected office bearers accountable? What's your capacity for recall? And so that's really what speaks, I think, to a lot of young people's lack of trust. And that's less to do with the financing and more to do with the system. But the second issue is that most of these legislative frameworks deal with the processes that are between contestants that face an electorate. Most of the processes do not include issues that pertain to internal dynamics within political parties. So who's elected as a political party leader? What campaigning went behind that, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm not sure whether or not, that very often is part of the problem. So Chris, those are just some initial thoughts. In terms of alternatives, in South Africa, our legislation has tried to introduce an alternative, which was to place before the electorate, not just, we do have public funding, we now have, which we've had since 1994, we now have the beginnings, I would say, of disclosures and transparency about private direct funding for political parties. But the third issue is to have what we call the multi-party democracy fund, which is to encourage people to donate to a fund that is going to then be allocated by the electoral management body to various parties contesting, because what you are encouraging is people, as was said earlier, to make a contribution even of 100 Rand to the idea of democracy. But of course, that has not been taken up very, very strongly. And in fact, one political party threatened to take the Electoral Commission to court because we tried to promote that fund. So that gives you an idea of some of the ambiguities. Thanks, Chris.
That's fascinating, Janet. Thank you so much for that. We'll get some comments on both of those interventions in a moment. But let me just open it. Anybody in the room like to join this conversation? Savilla?
I'm no expert on this either, so let me also put the disclaimer in. But I'm trying to understand the knowing your donor issue. Is that the issue, that you don't know the donor and the profile? Because does it matter? Of course, if it's illegal and the donor is involved in some kind of nefarious activities, yes, you can imagine you want to stay away from that. But is it about the influence? Isn't that the issue? That irrespective of who the donor is, the amount means you have the access and potentially you have the ability to gain an advantage from that position. So I'm trying to understand how the knowing your donor, apart from the obviously illegal source of funding, which one would, but where it's legal sources, but it's the access issue, then it doesn't matter really. Thank you.
So I think the policy is really not just about, understanding who your donor is and the source of the funding. The other element of it is then you're in a position where you can take, as a political party, you can take a risk-based approach as to whether or not you want to engage with that person. Because even if their source of funding or the source of the funding isn't necessarily from a nefarious or illegal source, if there are other, you talk about this issue of influence, if it comes from somebody who might be politically exposed, who might be directly related to a foreign power who is seeking to influence that political party or individuals within that political party, then you would want to make sure that you establish as much as you can do who the individual is. So one of the issues that we have, we talked about this at the beginning a little bit, is around unincorporated associations. Yeah. And unincorporated associations are a mechanism through which you can donate up to £25,000 without having to, the body doesn't have to declare where they got their source of funding from. So you can have quite large amounts of money up to that £25,000 threshold. It doesn't have to be identified, but you can have quite large amounts of money coming into the system and not really knowing, well, who, like I said, who is wielding influence behind those donations. And then for those political parties to be in a position where they can take that risk-based approach, as you would if you were a financial institution or if you were any other business. Well, do we actually want to engage with this individual? And what exactly is at the root of why have they donated this money? So even in the policy, we have a questionnaire that you would give to a donor to say, you've donated X amount, where is the funding from? What are your reasons for donating this money? And really just trying to dig into that a little bit more. And then from there, the party should be in a position where they can make an informed decision about whether or not that is the right source of funding for them.
So it's really about holding the party. I mean, the parties know where the money is coming from, right? It's not as if they're going to learn something.
Or they don't, or they rather not
choose,
know.
Right, they choose not to know because they think they know.
Yes.
And so this essentially forces them to know and have the public know that they know.
Yes.
There's very layers of reform here, but it's layers of knowing. I'm going to bring in one more guest online. Ko Espen is advisor to the president of Ghana. Ko, good to see you. Thank you for joining us. I'll bring you onto the stage. I don't know if you've got a guitar to play, but at least you can join in with a comment. Do you have a comment or a question? How are these playing out? How is this issue playing out in Ghana?
Thank you very much, Chris. And it's always exciting to join your programs. Very thought-provoking. Interestingly, in Ghana, at this particular point in time, we're going through a series of, I wouldn't say legislative or regulatory reforms, but more of an attitudinal thing. We don't have that many legislation that tackle political party financing or political financing or financing politicians. All we have is one legislation that has 2 sections that deal with who can give you money and the obligation on political parties to file returns with the Electoral Commission. And that's as far back as 1994, 95. There hasn't been anything else since then. But in Ghana, money and politics, sort of go hand in hand. And you find, politicians involved in a lot of scandals. I mean, we're currently in the middle of a storm with, a minister of state who had to resign as a result of monies found, about $1 million found in her house. And that was stolen from her house. And the special prosecutor has gotten involved with it, and so politics and money in Ghana, sort of go hand in hand. There was a comment that was made by one of the panelists. I can't remember who, but it's a theme that runs across all the conversation that has been had today, which is that there's the lack of transparency and the lack of trust of politicians. So when you go around and you speak to local people, asking them as to why they're getting involved in politics, or the first thing is money. But then when you talk about development and the fact that if the money comes to you, that means that your kid cannot go to school, it means that your roads cannot be built, it means that the infrastructure that you want cannot be available, the healthcare that you want is not available. Then they begin to, understand that really, okay, you can bring the money, but if you're not talking to us about real policies or real development goals, we're not going to vote for you. So, I mean, that's currently the situation in Ghana. And I think that to be able to root out money from politics in Ghana completely, it might be impossible, but it can be lessened. But there's got to be a commitment from the key players. There's got to be a commitment from the Electoral Commissioner. There's got to be a commitment from all the players involved, civil society, parliament, the courts, to be able to get us there. If a lot more people with integrity are able to go down to the grassroots, it then begins to change the way we approach politics and the money in politics. Thank you.
I don't think it's beyond reach that we can incrementally take the corrupting influence of big money out of our politics in the UK. History teaches us that whilst we might like wholesale change, precedent delivers incremental change, and we have to be patient when we take 2 steps back from our 1 step forward. It can feel at times in civil society like we're banging our heads against a brick wall, but then hopefully sometimes a scandal will come along, as I said earlier, and we have another ready solution to deal with the problem, to paraphrase a former Prime Minister.
So in 2020, the Intelligence and Security Committee released a report, and in that report, they said that the Electoral Commission should be given greater powers to deal with foreign interference in elections. And that's what I really wanted to end on, was this. So that happened in 2020, and then we know what happened subsequently thereafter. And I think we're still in a position where our Electoral Commission isn't necessarily fully empowered to tackle some of these issues. The minister from Jamaica made an excellent point earlier around who, ultimately it's about ensuring that we do the right thing and ensure we know who is wielding influence and for what purpose. So I think that when I reflect on the conversation that we've had, I think I'll end by just talking about the Electoral Commission and its own increasing concerns around the direction of travel. And there are some who have said that recent legislation has weakened the Electoral Commission to some extent. And I think that isn't a good sign, because we do need a strong independent regulator. So that for me is an area that I think going forward is, we need to make sure that the Electoral Commission is a force to be reckoned with, can conduct its investigations relatively quickly, and can, utilize the full scope of its enforcement mechanisms, both for civil and for criminal investigations.
Terrific. Well, on that note, we're going to end this event today. Thank you all for joining. Thanks again to the UK Anti-Corruption Coalition and to the Chandler Foundations. And thanks most importantly to our panel, Lloydette Bai-Marrow, Daniel Bruce, Gustavo Gorriti, and to all of you. With that, we are adjourned.